Welcome everybody to this webinar today. My name is Alison Airy and I'm the CEO of ACBC in New South Wales. We're really pleased to be doing this webinar on education today. For ACBC, education is a very important sector. Many of our members are from the education sector. And of course, it's a very important sector within the Australia-China business relationship. We were very pleased to collaborate with our members earlier this year to do a big conference on the Australia-China education relationship. And since then, we've been rolling out events on the education sector on various different themes. We're really pleased to be collaborating with Sinorbis today as well. Sinorbis has been a member of ACBC for a long time and has always been very generous in sharing its insights on the business relationship. So just a few things about the format today. We'll get things underway shortly. But what will happen is we'll have a presentation from Desmond, our speaker, and then there'll be the opportunity for you to ask questions of Desmond. And what we'll do is we'll ask you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. If you put your questions there, I can read them out to Desmond. Please also take the opportunity to use the chat function to comment and just to say hi to everybody else on the webinar. So we might dive straight in and hear from Desmond. Before we do, I'll give a brief introduction. Desmond's the business development manager for Sinorbis, and in this role he helps clients with marketing strategies with focus on China, and using those strategies to achieve their China market objectives. Education is also a focus for Desmond, but also it's a big focus, I know, for Sinorbis as a whole. His background is in programmatic and digital advertising, so he's very familiar with the digital marketing environments, both in Western markets and also in China. I'm pleased to say he's a product of our own education system. He did his degrees at the University of New South Wales in business and also advanced Chinese. So I'll now hand over to Desmond for a presentation. It'll run for sort of 20 to 30 minutes. After that time, we will have the opportunity for you to ask questions. So please have those ready. Desmond, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Alison. Really appreciate that. Very excited to be here. Talking about a really cool topic, I suppose, of how to develop an effective brand strategy to support Chinese recruitment. It's obviously China's been a bit of a golden goose for the Australian education sector for quite some time. And we're at a crossroads where a lot of universities need to consider how effective their specific brand strategy is in China that will allow them to continue to reap the benefits of this relationship. So we're going to go in a bit of a deep dive here about how this can be coordinated and how it can be actually obtained for most universities in the country. So today, we've broken it down into, I guess, 4 steps here. We'll talk about the Chinese digital ecosystem first. For some people on the call, I'm sure that's a given of knowing, the Chinese digital ecosystem and how it works. But, for most marketers, especially in the West and in Australia in particular, this is a complete black box. They know it's different, but exactly how and why and what to look out for is still a mystery for most Westerners. So it's worth exploring that. Secondly, talk about the importance of a digital strategy in China. It was a pleasure for myself to be present at the most recent education symposium that the ACBC put together, with a heavy focus on policy and strategy for China, which are absolutely incredible and very important components in developing a strategy, being part of the ecosystem that we live in Australia. However, one thing that maybe didn't get as much light, and that obviously as part of all of the events that ACBC is putting together, now we can talk about it, is the importance of developing a digital strategy and the importance of what the individual brand that each university has in China has as an impact on the student recruitment, and how they can actually control it and I guess improve the performance, which we do for every other country so easily, but for China, it's not so robust. We'll talk about some common mistakes and how to avoid them. We've got some pearlers to talk about. In Australia, where about 65% of all universities here are using our platform and are clients of ours, we know what these common pitfalls are. And to be honest, they're not specific to Australia. We'll see these same mistakes replicated in other markets that we serve across UK, all of continental Europe, Canada, North America, and of course, New Zealand. And finally, I guess we'll summarize this in terms of the 4 phases to success of what needs to be set up. But I'm sure you're a bit curious coming to an event to be learning around the Chinese digital ecosystem, and some Australian guy who has studied in NSW is up here talking. So I just thought it might be relevant, if you haven't heard of Sinorbis, just to give an overview of what we are and why we're experts in this space, and I suppose are quite qualified to discuss it. Sinorbis is a tech company, having built a software that allows Western companies, and namely a lot of universities, to build, measure, and optimize their whole digital presence for China without the need to physically be there. And this is, of course, very critical. The firewall that China has presents lots of challenges for Western companies. And in efforts to, I guess, alleviate these challenges and find solutions, the universities in particular end up creating problems that are long-term and systemic to their performance in China, and are hamstrung as a result. So that's why we've chosen to build the technology rather than be another service provider out there that actually gives the appropriate tools that enable our clients to be able to coordinate all these themselves with the same ease that they have for their Western platforms, but for China. So we're in contact with lots of universities and have seen almost everything at this point. But let's start off with something simple, right? The Chinese digital ecosystem. Simple is definitely not the right word to use there. And it's because of the scale and the size. Now, we think of the internet as, a global encompassing tool. But when you access the internet here in Australia, or for any Western country for that matter, you're accessing about 75% of the world. The other 25% live in China and are not connected to anything you're doing. And this is critical to understand, right? China, from the education perspective, we know that China is a very important market here in Australia, representing approximately 30% of all international students that we recruit. But this is only estimated to increase. China's population makes it a market of a scale of which, at least from the Australian perspective, is very hard to really understand. 40% of the world's e-commerce market is in China. Let that sink in just for a quick second to understand how much we're talking about here. So it's not just the fact that China has a large population, but it has a large active population of internet users who use digital platforms to control and operate their lives in its entirety. And I'll go into a little bit more detail when we discuss these channels specifically and how they are utilized to give you a sense. It's on another level that we can't really appreciate in our day-to-day lives here in Australia. So what does that ecosystem look like? So naturally, the firewall has created a division, right? 2 separate internets, where China has a separate internet to the rest of the world. But in doing so, and a kind of digital Darwinism has evolved here, where you have a separate set of Chinese applications and companies that have developed in exclusion to Western companies and their market interference. Now, it would be unfair to say that there's a Chinese equivalent for Western apps. It's a lot more complex and nuanced than that. To say Baidu is the same as Google, or that Facebook and WeChat are equivalent, is actually a falsehood. And as soon as you start thinking of these channels in that way, you've set up for failure in that you've misunderstood how these channels can be utilized if you're only looking at them through a Western lens. Ironically, this is also issues when it comes to English and Chinese translations, in that if you go for a direct translation, you will never arrive at the right word or message at the end of the day. So these channels get used in different ways. There are equivalents in terms of functionality, but in terms of what an overall app is able to produce, there are no direct equivalents unless you're talking about a subsidiary, for example, Douyin in China and their subsidiary TikTok, which is the Western version of their platform, which of course is widely popular. So, elephant in the room for the digital ecosystem in China is WeChat. And look, you've probably all heard about it. With over 1 billion users, it's hard not to hear about anything in the world that has over 1 billion people participating in it. But what's important to understand here is not just its prevalence in China, but how it gets used. 30% of all time spent on mobile is done through WeChat in China. 30%. If you think about all the time you spend on your phone in the day, would you spend it in one of those apps in particular? I always say that Facebook wishes it was WeChat. WeChat is what's referred to as a super app in China. There is an incredible amount of things that you can be doing in WeChat that makes it more than just a social media platform. Just to give you a quick sense, an individual can book a restaurant and coordinate with their friend to meet them at the restaurant, realize that they need a dog sitter while they go out and book that, order a cab, go to the restaurant, and on the way, order their food so it's ready when they arrive. At the restaurant, eat and enjoy, pay for the food, and return home without leaving the WeChat app. That was all done in WeChat. And I know that might seem like an overwhelming amount of functionality for a single application. You're thinking, well, okay, well, if I'm a university in Australia, how do I participate in that? And what are we doing? WeChat can be used in a much more simple context from a university perspective, especially a foreign university. Think of it as a source where you're producing content, more blog style content that people are engaging with, and you grow your follower base accordingly as people share and comment on your posts. And it's a means of direct communication whereby people who are following you can directly message you and start a conversation, which I'm sure from a recruitment perspective is obviously ideal. It's also a way in which you navigate to your website. I'll go into more detail about how this works later, but I just want to get the point across nice and early around the importance of WeChat. And if you don't know the latest figures on WeChat for your institution, or you haven't looked under the hood, or know what people are responding to or what they care about on your WeChat account, that should be a red flag. You should know. And so this is a really important point to emphasize early on. What about the importance of a digital brand strategy? So I guess we've articulated how important digital is in China in general, right? But why is it important as a Western university, an Australian university especially, to be thinking of a digital branding strategy? The primary reason is that all the great effort your marketing team have put in building your brand and reputation in the West
Okay, is it just me, or have we lost Desmond? Joanna, have you lost Desmond as well?
Yep.
Yeah. Apologies, everybody. I thought it might have been just me. Desmond, if you're able to hear me, we've lost you. If you're able to log back in. So apologies, ladies and gentlemen. We'll just wait a minute or so to give Desmond the opportunity to log back in. Steph, do you have a question, or had you just raised your hand to let us know of the problem? Okay. All right. Well, apologies everybody for this delay. If I can suggest that you, here he is, Desmond. Desmond, we seem to have you back. I think if you could rewrite rewind about 2 minutes. You were just talking about how universities should understand their WeChat stats, and then you froze.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Sorry, guys. It looks like my internet had cut out there. It's a classic COVID scenario. I'll just bring the PowerPoint back and we can jump straight into there.
Yes.
Lovely. So from here, I guess we had established the importance of digital in China, right, and how significant that is. But how important is it for a university in Australia to actually build a brand specifically through these digital channels, a digital brand? And I guess the most fundamental reason is that all the good effort that your marketing teams have put in to building their brand, their SEO capacity, their paid traffic, everything is irrelevant for China. The only thing that really carries over is a very high QS ranking, a global QS ranking that can get sort of identified and seen in China. But all of the actual things that make your institution unique, your unique selling propositions, are not conveyed well in China. And the classic example of this is how Western websites load in China. And I use the example of Massey University here, who are a highly reputable school, well ranked in their own right, and yet have a loading time in China of their website of over 30 seconds per page. Now, this is a technical issue. The two things that are going to determine whether you load in China or not for your web presence is, firstly, your content. It has to be coherent with the sort of any sensitive topics or anything that would undermine social cohesion in China, which is a very important cultural value as well. But also it's a technical issue. Now, for most universities, the cultural issues are not going to be too much of an issue. The technical issues are always, because these websites are typically hosted in their home countries and are specifically designed to be loaded in a Western context with, found via Google, which of course is blocked in China and unavailable, and to be loaded on Western softwares in Western browsers. And this, of course, is an issue in China, and it creates bad loading times, and effectively it means it's unusable, not to mention not visible. So it's really important in building up a digital brand, in that you have your foundation set up correctly. A website that is verified to be not only visible, but specifically adapted for Chinese engagements. One of the key things to think about here, and I'll talk more about this in detail later, but your website actually has to operate specifically in WeChat. By this, I mean WeChat will be a common way your website is accessed. And I'll discuss this in more detail later. But all you need to understand at this stage is that if your website isn't specifically optimized to load within the WeChat app, you're missing out on significant engagement that can link your social media activity with potential lead generation and other recruitment activities that you may want to engage in. So having a Chinese website is more than just changing the language. And it's more than just making sure the content's relevant for your Chinese audience. It's making sure that the technical foundation of the website allows it to be optimized for China. And of course, let's not forget the power of Chinese search engines. Now, you may often think or hear the trends in China that search engines are losing their popularity. And there is an element of truth to that, in that the functionality that search provides in China is being diluted as other social media channels are being used as search engines themselves. However, because it's China and because of what we discussed in terms of the scale of the market, you have Baidu, which is the largest search engine in China, about 60% market share, so not quite as Google equivalent, has 665 million active mobile users. So the mindset of thinking, oh, search is dead in China, I'm going to move on, that's the level of traffic you're missing out on. And so the oversimplifications that these concepts of trends or being plugged into China can often create is a complete misrepresentation of what opportunities are actually on the ground. And this is why, and the underlying theme I want to really hammer home, I suppose, in this presentation, if you take away anything, in that it's really important if you want to optimize your efforts in China, this has to be a collaborative work where different departments and people with different expertise and skill sets can contribute to your performance in China in order to make it more effective. We'll come back to that point, but if you take away anything from this, let it be that if China gets left to one person to run, it's set up for failure. It's unfair on that particular individual to look after a whole market and optimize all these channels that normally 2 teams worth of people would do for the Western equivalents. But also, it just means that no one else is capable of contributing for that success. So you have to have the right tools in order to set yourselves up for success. And on that point around, the content, this is what I'm talking around. When you have one person looking after China, we think as universities, okay, maybe we can cut some corners here. Maybe we can repurpose a lot of our Western content, just translate it to Chinese, which of course is very labor intensive in its own right. And we'll use that. And that's what we'll disseminate on our Chinese channels. You'll be doing yourself a disservice by doing that, because ultimately most of that content won't be relevant for your Chinese audience. And this is why I bring up this slide here, because WeChat content is around quality over quantity. In WeChat, on the service account, which would be the most common account you may create as an official verified WeChat account, you're limited to posting 4 times per month. So that means that your content has to be good. And there's no such thing as sort of spam in this case. So in various studies and interviews, people have come across, what makes WeChat content relevant and what would make them share, which will be the key to your organic growth on this channel. What would make them share your content? Well, it's got to be useful. It's got to be interesting or emotionally touching. Plain and simple. If all your messaging is how good campus is, what life is like on campus, and how good your university is, and the technology department did this, and the marketing department did this, you will not get cut through in China, because you're missing out on anything that makes it specifically relevant to this audience. Now, any marketer would know this, but unless the marketers have access to what you're doing in China and can properly contribute, they cannot bring that level of expertise. So this is a very important point, that you want to have content that's relevant for China. The classic example of this is what happened recently. In the middle of the year, the Gaokao results are coming out in China. The most important exam results a Chinese child will have, and their entire school career is basically boiled down to this one mark. So it's the most important moment in their lives at this point. A lot of pressure on the family to achieve a certain result for various reasons. If you're a university and you're trying to engage with your audience and you haven't mentioned anything about the Gaokao, you're not talking about things that they care about. And I know this, not just in Australian universities, but universities all over the English-speaking world. Most of them had missed this opportunity because they weren't thinking around a target audience that required specific messaging in order to get high levels of engagement that will lead to more inquiries, more engagement going forward. So keep this in mind. And this is why I want to spend some time here just breaking down that point. But it brings us nicely into common mistakes. These are going to be just the top 4 mistakes. There's lots of little mistakes everyone can make in China because it's so difficult, right? It is intensely difficult to do remotely. And even if you do have a team in China, in order to coordinate, to make sure everyone's aligned on how your brand should be projected in China and how you would coordinate your recruitment efforts there, it's very, very difficult to organize. So this is the first mistake, and it's arguably the most common. Ownership of your assets. So before Sinorbis came along, unless you wanted to have a physical presence in China with a campus and a business license and a corresponding ICP license, which is a multi-million-dollar, multi-year venture, unless you have that, the only way you could have created a digital presence in China is if you had an agency do it, right? You'd approach an agency in China, and they'd create and operate the WeChat account or website for you. Now, legality aside, because there are some legal gray areas in what they set up in terms of ownership, they will more often than not own the WeChat account. Now, this, of course, is an existential threat to the university. Because if you did do a great job and you got excellent content out there, you built your follower base, it's a great source of leads and as a recruitment channel for you. Well, if you want to move away from that agency for whatever reason, in any number of years down the line, you lose everything you've built in China. Now, there's been a combination of clients that we've had who have had this set up before we came along, who either didn't know and were flabbergasted to find out that was the case, or did know and thought, look, we didn't have any other choice. This was the only option that was available to us. So owning your assets is incredibly important. Not only that, if you do end up leveraging an agency to do this because you feel you don't have a choice, I think it's important to make sure that you at least hold that agency to the same standard you would a Western agency with your Western business. And a lot of universities I've spoken to don't, it seems. They rely on periodic reporting, where they're getting reports on their Chinese presence, in talking like web traffic, WeChat follower growth, etc. You're getting reports maybe once a month, once a quarter. And that might seem like, okay, no, fair enough, we're keeping track of things. But what that means is that you can't make any changes to your strategy and your messaging in China unless it's in those periods of time where you've got the data, which is already out of date by the time you get it. So if you're getting quarterly reports, it means you can make 4 changes a year. If you ask the marketing team for your domestic marketing team to make only 4 changes a year to their marketing, they'd be furious. It's almost an unacceptable level of attention that the engagement on these Chinese platforms get. But the reason is because nobody in the teams, in the Australian teams, really know what's going on. How can they get that level of visibility if WeChat can only be used by one person who manages out of their phone? How are they actually going to be enabled to contribute? And again, this is why having the right tools is so important in engaging this audience in China. The question that I guess you should always ask yourself with what you're doing in China is, would I allow this for my Western channels? 9 times out of 10, the answer is no. Would I allow a third party to own my Facebook account? Absolutely not. The double standard that China can often create does not need to be there. It's not fair on the Chinese speaking teams that end up having to lift the load of dealing with all of this together, and it's also not fair on the Western teams who are need to be able to contribute to get greater performance in China, and in many cases, in Australia's instance, potentially compensate for the external factors that may affect recruitment in the coming years. Australian universities need to ensure that their brands are stronger than ever, because if you don't have a strong brand in China, you are exclusively succumb to the external forces that you cannot control. It's why it's important to have a good brand for any business with any market. But especially in this case, that's why I'm highlighting why it's important for Australian universities in particular when it comes to China. Mistake 2 is only running campaigns at admission time. I have more sympathy for this mistake because of budgets, right? Marketing budgets that we get for universities, they're tight. There's not an infinite source of it. But in doing so, say you have a marketing budget for China and you're allowed to run campaigns maybe 6 weeks before the key admission time. Unfortunately, what ends up happening is that the full funnel of purchase decision is completely neglected. Oops, let's go back here. We know that 31% of all Chinese students looking to study abroad will start their research journey 2 years in advance. Now, if they're only going to find out about you as a serious candidate they should be considering 3 weeks before the admission date, because that's when you decided to target them with an ad, the odds of turning them into a student are next to 0. By the time they're seeing that ad, if you're just running it at recruitment time, they've already done their research online. They've already likely spoken to recruiters, their families and friends. They've already pre-created a short list of universities that they would like to go to, having not heard or understood properly around your offering, and even gone to physical events. So I suppose it's important to articulate that when we're talking around running campaigns in China, it's important to understand that there are going to be various goals. Thinking of campaigns equals leads is not a proper representation of how that budget could be properly leveraged for the best result. Ultimately, you have to understand first how your brand is perceived in China. Are you widely known? Are you better known as your competitors? How are you perceived against your competitors? And only then will you understand where that budget is probably best served. If, for example, you're lacking significant awareness in relation to your competitors, it might be worth spending the budget throughout the year instead in building your brand that you can then use to trigger your organic growth and organic lead generation and representation of Chinese applications. Because ultimately, the low-hanging fruit of people who just needed that final reminder to apply with you and then seeing that ad 6 weeks out is very small. And so you're constantly chasing your tail every year, trying to get these results because you haven't invested in your brand to begin with. And just focusing on, oh, how many registrations can I get right now that I've got budget to spend? So important to think about the funnel as a whole and how you might coordinate that. The third mistake, this is a really interesting one that I think is actually quite specific to universities. The others, you can say apply to many other different companies as well, which they do. But mistake 3 is not understanding the stages of the student journey, or at least not applying the relevancy of those stages in your marketing activities through these channels. Because there's going to be current students that is separate to your prospective students and separate again to your alumni. Now, all 3 of these types of students, there's opportunity to engage with them on certain levels. Obviously, if they're prospective students, the opportunity is to get them to apply. If they're current students, the opportunity is to get them to promote, like have them as key opinion leaders on your campus, promoting your university to their friends and family and connections back home. And then afterwards, potential for potentially further engagement with their studies in master's programs and postgraduate courses. But also for them to be advocates for you on the ground in China. Now, what ends up happening with the university recruitment, though, is that all the effort gets put in the before time, in the prospective stage, getting them to apply. And once they're in, the best the university has to offer is, oh, join our WeChat group and we'll keep you up to date. It's not good enough, unfortunately, because it's a missed opportunity. The ability for you to grow your awareness and your engagement organically in China will come into how you're able to get multiple voices singing praise of your university and your unique selling proposition. The students that you're able to have at any particular point in time on campus will be the best KOLs or key opinion leaders for you. If you're not leveraging them properly and encouraging them to promote through your official channels, it's a wasted opportunity. And likewise, once they become alumni and they've graduated, being able to engage with them in a meaningful way is also going to be significant because there's potential for them to come back for further study with you, but also for them to be able to, promote to their family and friends thereafter. Again, using your official channels as the voice that they can disseminate to their networks. So ultimately, what I'm getting at here is that you actually need to have a different message for each of those stages of the journey in order to engage with them properly to achieve the opportunity that each one of those presents. And if you're just spending all your time talking around prospective student messaging, you've potentially missed the opportunity here to grow your brand properly in China. So finally, thinking WeChat and website are mutually exclusive as a common mistake. This is a good one. And I alluded to this earlier when I talked about how websites and WeChats are not mutually exclusive. That one of the key ways your website will be accessed is through the WeChat account, and therefore your website actually has to be optimized for WeChat. This is just a little diagram that illustrates that, maybe makes it a little bit clearer, but your WeChat account will have a menu system, and that menu system will have subheadings for different types of information, where you can see life on campus, different types of fields of study, maybe even COVID safety protocols that are being followed at the moment, whatever it may be. The user experience expectation is that those links will navigate to the website, and your website will then be accessed in the WeChat app. We've got the University of South Australia here as an example, because they do it quite well. But when we're talking around website and WeChat, because I often get asked, oh, I've heard that I don't need a website because WeChat is more important. when I hear that, I do understand at that point that the person I'm speaking with doesn't quite understand how these channels work, and specifically what the user experience is for a Chinese student. The only way that you can convert a Chinese prospective student on WeChat into a new lead for your recruitment team to follow up with, is if they navigate to your website and fill out a lead form. There's no way to actually do that in WeChat. And this is a really important point, that you want to have these pathways to conversion at every interaction. And a lot of universities miss this step because they misunderstand the significance of web and WeChat together. So what are these phases to digital success in China? I guess if we were to summarize this in a concise way, I guess the first thing we'd say is to build these assets, but make sure that they're done properly. Make sure that not only are they going to load well in China and that they're optimized for Chinese websites, and that you have full control and transparency from the West to be able to influence the content that gets displayed, but that you own the domain name and you own the assets and you own your WeChat account, because unless you have ownership, it is an existential threat to your performance and visibility in China in the long term or even medium term. The second thing to do is to make sure that you establish your presence organically. Now, this involves creating that good content that we're talking around, making sure that the content is relevant for the Chinese audience. You're not just repurposing Western content exclusively and translating it. I think that's a job well done. It's important to make sure that your brand is articulated clearly to the Chinese audience and that it's relevant to them. And that needs to be, I guess, coordinated across both web and WeChat and other social media channels you may be engaging with. The reason why we focus on web and WeChat so much here in this presentation is because they're the foundations. It doesn't really matter who you are or what you want to do in China. If you don't have those two things set up, you are invisible. And in terms of those pathways to conversion, it's all well and good to have a Douyin account, but unless you're able to convert that traffic, then what good is it? So really important to have all this set up. The third thing, I guess, the phase that you may find yourself in is when you can start testing and adapting. This again comes back to having the right tools to make sure that you have the right feedback mechanisms in place to test and adapt your content. Does this message resonate? How much interest are we getting in this topic? Should we be discussing more about this? And it's only when you're testing and learning this content, being able to see the responses in real time, are you able to actually optimize your performance in China? Because otherwise what ends up happening is that you end up doing the same thing year after year, where the expectation is you want to see better results, but the input of change has not been created because you don't know what to change, because you don't have the data to support it. So that's why it's really important to have tools that are as good as your Western channels are, in that we have live updates and reporting dashboards for almost everything. But for China, again, that double standard comes into play, and they think, oh, too hard, I don't understand. I'll get the third party or the China team or whatever, I'll make them responsible for that periodic reporting, and then we'll make changes based on that reporting. But ultimately, in our current world with things changing at every moment, it's not sufficient to connect with your audience properly. And who will expect more, by the way. And finally, it's ramping up your efforts and improving your efficiency and cost effectiveness. So this comes into making sure you don't have bottlenecks in your Chinese digital and your branding efforts in China. If you have to go through one specific individual just because they speak Chinese, it's not an efficient operation, and it should be reviewed. I know it's easier said than done. A lot of for these university structures, it's quite complicated to change that. But ultimately, what we find is that once the marketing teams start having access and understanding and be able to input into what happens in China, everything becomes easier, because you've got multiple eyes, multiple hands making light work. And this one person who's been allocated to look after China doesn't have to do all the heavy lifting for everything, create the content, do the translations, manage the social media network, take care of all the admissions inquiries. It's too much for one person, especially when it's your most significant international market by far. You want to make sure that there's plenty of support, and that the Western teams are actually able to contribute to create that sort of scale of approach where you can do more, rather than just equipping one person with better tools, but still having just that one person. So what I would say here is that we discussed a lot. And if you think that you're unsure about any of the points that we've gone over today, I'd encourage you to reach out to have a chat about it, because we'd be happy to coordinate a free audit report of your Chinese digital presence. If you're unsure or want further clarification and understanding on how you actually perform in China now, how visible are you really? How do you rank compared to your competitors in an organic digital setting? I would encourage you all to get in touch, and we'll be happy to put that report together for you, because it's really important to understand this is the first instance. We often get, I ask marketing managers, oh, so how does your website perform in China? And they say, oh, I hear it's good. I'm like, oh yeah, can you tell me more about that? And the common answer, unfortunately, is that, oh, well, we have a China representative there, and they load the page and they say it's fine. And unfortunately, with that level of investigation, there's no way to uncover really where the gaps are, because China presents itself in such an obscure way that we want these easy answers. But unless you have all the right tools set up to do that, it's very hard to see what is working. And so in most cases, those websites, when I hear that answer, don't load in China very well. Again, it's no fault of the universities. It's just because they're not using the right tools and enabling their teams to do it in the right way. So I hope that was valuable, and you guys are able to walk away with a lot more insight or understanding, or at least curiosity about this to investigate further. And I'll be happy to help down the line with anything further.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Desmond, for that really compelling presentation on this subject. Now we will move to the Q&A part of the event. So if you have questions, as I said earlier, please put them in the Q&A button, and I'll read them out. The first question we have, Desmond, is, can you share your slides? So I assume the answer to that one is yes.
Yes, yes, it's free.
So we'll circulate a copy of the slides to everybody. So while people are thinking of their questions, I thought I'd just home in on the point that you made about putting content out there that is useful and emotionally relevant to Chinese prospective students. And you mentioned how few of the Western institutions had mentioned Gaokao in the content that they put out. What's an example of a message or a campaign that you would put out which centered around the whole issue of the Gaokao?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. The Gaokao I use as an example because of how significant it is and how you can pinpoint it in the calendar exactly and say, we need to be talking around this time. If you wanted to think about ideas, now I'm no copywriter, but I do know that this time and lead up to the Gaokao especially creates a lot of strain and stress on the family. And that's the emotion, the primary emotion. So if you're a marketer and you're thinking of how to relate to an audience, well, it comes into connecting with how they feel. Alleviating that from a university perspective, if you want to have the right message there, talking around study tips or pathways for further education if your first selection in China falls through. As an example, these kind of things resonate with the fears and worries and concerns that the students and parents are having in that point in time. And so the content is naturally more relevant. And then you can tie in the value of your institution into that story. Say for study tips, for example, having some value presented there in terms of some actual tips to focus and study and how to prepare yourself mentally for the exam, not just in terms of cramming the content, but you can also relate that potentially to how you support your students to study more effectively and better at your institution. And how learning how to study is a journey we all have to go on and learn through life and get better and better at it, and how your institution is primarily effective in helping them achieve that. There's lots of ways that the marketing teams can get creative here and how they want to relate the messages of the institution to these emotional concerns that students and parents have in China. But unless you've given the marketing team rein to access that and be able to experiment, see what resonates, see what doesn't, it'd be very hard to be able to have an effective content strategy.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, we've got some questions rolling in now. Some person has commented that they can't use the Q&A function. If that's the case for you, please use the chat function. I can see the chat as well as the Q&A. Now, the first question is, it's about the services that Sinorbis offers. So apart from research and consulting services, does Sinorbis also set up and operate WeChat accounts for overseas university? Is this part of your service scope?
Yeah, that's a fair question because I hadn't actually talked about that. So our platform and our software gives the teams everything they need, all the tools to manage it themselves. But yes, we know that not everybody has a Chinese digital marketing team just waiting, ready to jump into this project and may need some assistance, at least on occasion. So in which case we do have an operations team specifically there to assist, so we can provide additional services should they be required. Things like website creation, WeChat account creation, website management, SEO, translation. We don't try and sell services, though. I'll make that clear about Sinorbis. It's not really the core of what we do. The reason we provide them is because we want our clients to see results from China. Because ultimately, the longer our clients are seeing results from China, the longer they stay subscribing to our software. So it's an easy equation for us to put all that together. And our clients really do appreciate that flexibility that, if they do need assistance for these kinds of services where either they don't have the capacity to or are temporarily unable to, they can lean on us and our services to fill the gap.
Okay, thank you. Now I've got another question. This one's about WeChat again. So the WeChat has recently developed a new user agreement, which is different from the Weixin version. How are the two how do the two, I guess, different user agreements impact on the user's behavior? And what's the implication for student recruitment in China?
That's a really good question. To be honest, I think those new terms, given that they affect those international accounts, and we're talking around domestic student recruitment from Chinese domestic student recruitment, it may not be that relevant on the whole. However, I'd have to investigate on more of the specifics of the terms changes to know. Given that they're all very new, I guess all of the ins and outs of how that impacts every type of WeChat account is yet to be fully understood. So if that person who asked that question, if they want to send me an email, I'll be happy to actually follow up on that, because we do engage with Tencent quite regularly on these things, and we can come back with a more firm answer. It'd be hard for me to say at this stage.
Okay, thank you. Now here's another one. Is there a way to help Australian brands own their Chinese social channels without them registering as a foreign entity in China?
Yes, there is. So you're right in that the easiest way to create a WeChat account is to create a Chinese presence physically with a business license. Without doing that, this is how we create WeChat accounts for our clients under their names. And being a Tencent technology partner, we've been able to do this historically, where there are processes available that allow Western companies to build a WeChat account as a what's called a universal service account. So it's not a domestic one. The functionality is almost identical. However, it is classified separately to a domestic WeChat account. The process for that involves a lot of paperwork. We help our clients fill it out, and then we submit it to Tencent on their behalf. Now, once it's there, it has to be manually approved by Tencent. Now, that process, we've seen some turn around in 2 to 3 weeks. We've seen some turn around in 3 to 4 months. It's very hard to predict. Depends on the time of year. Depends on who's there at Tencent at the time. But ultimately, the end result is just, the institutions end up with a WeChat account owned by them under their name that they just need to verify annually with Tencent directly. And it will be a universal account if they don't have a physical presence in China to create a domestic one.
Okay, thank you. Now here's another one about WeChat. There's always lots to talk about with WeChat. So this one says it's been difficult to have WeChat ad accounts approved by WeChats for clients in the Australian education industry. So interesting. If others wanted to just comment in the chat about whether that's been your experience, that would be interesting to know. But anyway, this is the experience of this user, and she said, is this and he or she, I should say, why am I assuming the questioner is a she? But this questioner is saying, is this an issue occurring across all sectors at the moment? This is the difficulty of having WeChat ad accounts approved by WeChat at the moment. Do you have any insights into that?
Well, the primary insight, and this comes from a firm understanding of China and Tencent, the goalposts are constantly changing. So whatever I say now, whoever's watching a recording at different points in time, it may be completely different. When it comes to creating the ad accounts, another primary motivator here is what kind of ads you're going to be running. So at the moment, you can't run lead generation campaigns on WeChat as a general rule for educational institutions. And this is tied in with a lot of the reform that's happening in the education sector in general in China at the moment. The same is the case for many other different sectors. It depends on the sector. And that's how these things get judged. So the property sector, for example, can't run lead generation campaigns either. And that was primarily brought to address certain predatory advertising for different types of properties that weren't built. And this was regulation brought in for that. But ultimately, these sweeping reforms and changes to the systems and how they work are done on a whim. And so it's very hard to predict where it goes from now and what it allows you to do. At the moment, universities can create ads for WeChat, and you can create an ad account. However, that would likely have to be done for either follower generation, or you can create ads through other channels for more lead generation where your traffic is directed to your website. But yeah, I want to emphasize that the goalposts are constantly shifting, and it's not specific to the education sector.
Okay. All right. And when you say lead generation ad, perhaps that's the difficulty this questioner is having. What defines something then as a lead generating ad?
A lead generating ad is referring to an ad that is designed to drive to a landing page or a sort of a native form within the app that you're using, to then allow people to submit their personal identifiable information to be followed up with later or engage with or subscribe or whatever. Okay. That would be as opposed to different other kinds of ads, which say in the case of WeChat, I'm talking around follower acquisition ads, where the ads literally drive to your WeChat page that you can then select follow, and that's it. That was the intent of the ad and mission accomplished. Whereas lead generation ads are specifically for collecting information.
Right. Okay. All right. Now, another question here. Can you run paid advertising with the universal account you mentioned?
Yes, you can, with the aforementioned restrictions, which again are always changing. So you absolutely can. We run advertisements as a service for our clients all the time. But every time we run it, we have to check to see what the latest rules and regulations are that we have to adhere to, and what kind of ads can be run, and who can run them.
Okay. Still on WeChat, Desmond, there's somebody who's asked, do you see big value for universities in setting up mini programs on WeChat?
That's a good question. I do see value in it. Setting up mini programs is great, but it's hugely expensive. So unless the right value is being generated from those mini programs that you can quantify, it might not be worth doing. These mini programs need to be created from scratch effectively. For those of you who don't know, a mini program is basically an app within WeChat. So we talked about WeChat being a super app. How about an inception app where there's apps within apps? And that's effectively what it is. But ultimately, the functionality you'd want from your mini program can be served by your website if you set it up properly. But if you want to supplement that with a mini program, I think that's great and could be done. However, the investment required to do that would have to really be justified to make sure you're getting the right return.
Okay. Thank you. Now, I'm not sure that I understand this question. So if this was your question, you might need to just give us a bit more information, but I'll read it out and Desmond might understand it. Can agencies use the Sinorbis platform to support their Chinese marketing clients? Okay, so I
Yeah,
guess if you're an agency, yeah, and you've got clients, yep.
that is a really good question. And it's actually quite timely. So the first answer to that is if the university is the direct clients of ours,
Okay,
leverage our platform to do it, because you can give access to whoever you want. Oh, yeah.
okay.
Oh, was
Desmond,
cutting
for
out, was
me,
it?
yeah, you were breaking up. Because could you just repeat the answer, please? Are you able to repeat your answer?
Okay, I think we're back now. Okay, great. Yes. So, firstly, in the first instance where you're an agency and your client is our client effectively, so they're using our software. It all comes down to them giving you access, and of course you can access it and take on everything, and it becomes really easy to do. And it's a great relationship where you've got collaboration between agency and the client in a direct way. Now, I can mention that. Sinorbis is likely to look to create a specific area of the business that can cater more to agencies directly. It's a model that is being worked out. So stay tuned, and I'll be happy to keep you personally informed for anyone who is interested in that, whereby we can create a solution for our software that will actually enable the agencies to use our technology, which of course would likely change almost everything about how they're able to perform in China, and how they can, the ease of use to put everything together, reducing their costs. But it's something that we may be looking into, and can keep everyone updated accordingly.
Fantastic. Okay. Look, we might we do have one last question, but before I ask that, I might ask Joanna if you could launch the poll, and members of the audience, if you could just take a second or two to answer this poll, that would give us useful information. We are, Desmond, we're also becoming a data-driven organisation, collecting data. But while people are doing the survey, could I just ask this final question, which is, would you say that there is importance in having different messaging for parents or influencers in the student journey?
Yes, the parents, absolutely, right? So not only are they key decision makers in the process, but also they're going to have slightly different concerns. For example, we know from the data that safety is a larger concern for parents than it is for students. Still important for both. However, if the safety concerns the parents have aren't being addressed in your materials and how you engage with the audience, it's likely to be less effective because of how highly ranked of importance it is. So with that in mind, I guess it's important to know that when you're producing content, and you can do this with our platform. I don't mean for this to be any kind of sales pitch for a function, but it's important to this point where you can segment your audience and your WeChat audience and actually create different content that gets sent to those different groups. So you could segment between your parents versus your prospective students, or your alumni, or your students, or your KOLs, and have different content for each of them, which is going to be really important because, like we talked about here, if you just break this down to the fundamental concept of what are you doing here, you're marketing to a target audience. And so you want to have a specific message sent at the right time to the right person. And if you're doing one message for everyone in the country, you're not really doing that.
Sorry, I was muted to keep out some household noise there. But look, it's bang on 2 p.m, so that was really good timing. Thank you for being such a great engaged audience and asking such great questions. Thank you for your feedback as well. Please feel free to just email us directly to give us further feedback, including things that you would like us to cover or do differently in the future. We're always open to all feedback. But thank you very much to Desmond and to Sinorbis for taking time to speak to us today. I think this was a really very useful, I personally think it was a very useful webinar, and have provided some real food for thought for people in this really key industry. So thank you everybody. Looking forward to staying engaged with everybody and continuing to explore themes in this really important sector for Australia. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alison. Thank you, everyone. Looking forward to speaking down the line.
Thank you.
Bye.